So this morning you've had the chance to experience the Williams academic experience from the perspective of a student or a participant. A variety of modes depending on what you chose: lectures, laboratories, performances, tutorials, seminars. And I hope you found it engrossing and intense and exciting. And my reaction to this is always, it's hard to imagine how any student confines themselves to 32 courses during their time here. So that's what it's like to be a student. And what we'd like to do for the next hour is turn to a different perspective, the perspective of faculty, and think about some questions that I think are important to our faculty. Why do we teach at Williams? And how do we teach? And how is that teaching changing as we go through the decades? And fundamentally, what do we hope to accomplish with the students who come here? So it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. First to my left is Denise Buell. Denise is the Dean of the Faculty and the Cluett Professor of Religion. She's been at Williams since 1997. She earned her undergraduate degree from Princeton and her PhD from Harvard. Her area of specialty is Christian history and its interpretation. Before becoming dean, we got a lot of work out of Denise. She served on many standing committees and in many leadership roles, including as chair of the religion department, chair of on the faculty steering committee, the task force for faculty planning, and as associate dean of the faculty. So to Denise's left, I guess to your right, is Edan Dekel, associate professor of classics. Edan has been here at Williams since 2005. His bachelor's degree is from Brown and PhD from Berkeley. And Edan is interested in Greek and Roman poetry, comparative epic, biblical studies, ancient Judaism, and medieval literature. And finally, we have Protik Majumder, professor of physics, director of the Science Center, and chair of the Science Executive Committee. Tiku's been here at Williams since 1994. He did his undergraduate work at Yale and his PhD at Harvard, where we were graduate students together, what seems like a very long time ago. And Tiku's record of developing young scientists is absolutely phenomenal. And just yesterday, we had the wonderful news that one of his thesis students, Ben Algenrom, who graduated just this summer, has won the Apgar Award from the American Physical Society, which is the nation's highest honor for undergraduate physics research. And now, so this is actually the second time that one of Tiku's students has won the Apgar, and actually the fifth time for Williams undergraduates in physics. But the first of Tiku's winners was in 2002, when the award was given to Charlie Dorette, and Charlie is now an assistant professor of physics here at Williams. So let me start by asking each of you, we think about our students a lot. We've all had many students. But to share a story about one student who is particularly important to you, or whose story was particularly compelling. And for this, I'll just start with you, Denise.
Great. So I think often we hope we have an influence on our students that we may or may not know. It's sort of aftermath, unless we're lucky enough to hear from them after the fact. And I want to tell a little anecdote about a student who may not know how much influence she had on me. And this is a student, I'm going to admit, I decided not to pick a religion major because there were too many. So I'm going to pick a student who was a biology major and who took a class that I taught for the Women's Gender Sexuality Studies program, which is one of the other places that I contribute curricularly at the college. And KB D'Angelo, who was the class of 2012, took this senior capstone class with me, and I had developed it in a way that would be interesting to me in terms of the things I was teaching with the students, but hopefully would be appealing to them from a range of disciplines. And KB was a very quiet student, but whenever she contributed, it was super, super high quality in this small seminar. And she wrote a fantastic paper about her experience, both having contracted and being treated for Lyme, but also her studies in microbiology about Lyme. And what she doesn't know is that her writing about microbiology and its effects on her personal experiences on immunology totally transformed the way I've been doing my own writing and thinking about how early Christian ways of thinking about healing and illness relate to contemporary, current biological discussions of how we think about health and illness. So I'm just going to stop there with my little anecdote, but something that could only happen, I think, in a liberal arts college setting.
Terrific.
Such a great story. I also had trouble thinking of only one student to single out for an anecdote. And when I thought about my classics majors and religion majors that I work with in multiple courses, it just became overwhelming. But there is a student who is an English major that had particularly important story for me and for what I think is Williams at its best. Megan was a sophomore, and she signed up for my winter study course. People often think of winter study as a time for play, a time for kind of free exploration. This was a winter study on etymology and dictionaries and word games called The History of Words, and Megan wanted to be an English major. And in the course of the class, we were talking about etymologies, and I talked a lot about the Anglo-Saxon language, the sources of English, and I made some offhand remark about how my best friend in graduate school, became friends with him because we had had a very heated argument about Beowulf, the great Old English poem that had gotten a little physical in the fight. And that led to us becoming best friends. And for some reason, Megan had held on to this idea, and after the winter study was over, and she'd been rather quiet in the class, she came up to me and she said, "You know, Professor Dekel, I'm thinking about being an English major, and I fell in love with Beowulf when I read it in my English survey class. And I'm a first-generation college student, and I read about this program Williams is offering. Now we call it the Davis Fellowship. Then it was the Williams College Undergraduate Research Fellowship for first-generation college students who were thinking about possibly a career in academia, a future. Wonderful summer program where they work with a mentor for a whole summer and then for the next 2 years of their undergraduate education. And she said to me, I know it's a little crazy, I've never had you in a real class and we've only known you for this one winter, but would you consider being my mentor for this program? And it was so brave of her to just come to my office like that and to lay it out and to talk about her passion for it. How could I say no? And so I said yes, and we worked in this mentorship program, and it went so well that she wanted to actually work on the Old English language, so she asked me to do an independent study course, and so the next fall I taught her to read Old English. We sat week after week in my office, and she learned the language, and little by little, she developed into a full-fledged scholar of this field. And I never had her in a real class until her spring of her senior year. By then, she had also started taking Latin so she could do medieval literature more fully. And I finally had her as a senior in a class. And then she went off and is now doing graduate work in medieval literature at the University of Michigan. And the serendipity of the conversations and the bravery of our students intellectually, that they know that they can come through an open door and ask a professor a crazy question. He might not say yes, but sometimes he will. That, for me, is the most extraordinary thing here.
I just echo the sentiments of how difficult it is to pick one story, but let me just tell you for a minute about an amazing young woman who I met only in my second year at Williams way back. Julie Rappaport, class of 1997, was a sophomore, not sure if she wanted to do physics, dealing with the well-known issue of gender underrepresentation in physics. She was one of only a couple of women in the class. She was really interested in English, and so she ended up declaring an English and physics double major, but still really very unsure about what she wanted to do at the time. I welcomed her into my research laboratory in one of the first summers, and we really didn't have much in my lab at that point. It was just, we were literally just building things, designing things, constructing things, and testing things. And Julie she just blossomed in this environment where all of a sudden, instead of being in a classroom with lots of people, it was just a couple of students working together with me in this sort of collaborative way. And again, there wasn't a lot of data, there wasn't a lot of results, this was just about building stuff. She came to me afterwards and said, you know, I really like building stuff. I think I want to do a thesis with you, and I want to build something and design something. She got really interested in engineering and kind of wanting to go in that direction, remained an English and physics double major, and was very instrumental in building a central piece of apparatus that remains today the key element that, for example, my latest student, Ben Augenbraun, was able to use to achieve the results that he did in my lab. So that's almost 20 years later. So Julie, as she got more and more interested, she decided, I want to go to graduate school, not in physics, but I love this idea of doing applied work. She went and did a PhD in materials and civil engineering. She learned about concrete. She became an expert in the science of concrete design, okay? So needless to say, we neither teach engineering courses at Williams nor concrete courses at Williams. But it's a great story about how we can teach these skills that can just go in all sorts of interesting directions. So she has had 2 really cool jobs that have come out of this PhD. First, she was hired by a company called Exponent that does, get this, forensic engineering. They analyze why buildings fail after they fail. They kind of go in there. And when she was talking to the other people in the company, they were like, oh, we love the science. We love the kind of like, the CSI part of it where you're trying to figure out what went wrong. But the thing we hate about it is having to explain it, talk to people about it, and write reports. And Julie was like, wait a minute, I'm an English double major. I went to Williams. That's the fun, that part's just as fun for me. And she thrived in that company and now has actually moved on to another extremely cool company in California called CalStar that, coming back to her roots, has figured out a way to build concrete-based products with much less carbon footprint than conventionally. And you can imagine, given the amount of concrete in the world, that if you could figure out how to make this very carbon-intensive project of making concrete for just a little bit less energy, it makes a big impact. So she's the chief scientist and vice president of this company in California. And again, responsible for all these sort of outreach and public information things. She's the one who leads the design and interfaces with all sorts of government and public officials out there, and she's still in that company. So I love the story of, here's what we do at Williams, and our students go in these remarkable directions. Hard to but when it's hard to sort of trace the line back, but you can see how the little seed and the kind of like the different skills, in this case, physics and English, kind of led in some interesting way to some amazing careers.
So staying on the subject of our students, you've been here 10 years or 20 years, depending. I'd be interested in reflections on how that student body is changing, has changed over those 10 or 20 years, and kind of what that means for your work with students.
I could start? Sure.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So
Very polite.
one of the things that I've noticed and this is probably specific to being somebody who's teaching about religion, is when I first arrived here, I teach a lot of courses on the history of Christianity, as well as sort of what we think religion is, theory and methods of religion. Not too many students who were taking my classes were strongly identified with a religious tradition. They might have had a tradition of upbringing that they were kind of still somewhat engaged with, but in many cases they might have come from a household where the parents had different religious backgrounds and hadn't particularly raised the children in any observance. And that formed an interesting kind of dynamic for my teaching, because I then had some students who were curious but had to have a little spark about why would we care about thinking about what religion is today, or why the way people talk about early Christian history might matter for the present, and how strange and different Christianity in the past might be relative to the present. But over my time here, I've noticed that more students are coming to Williams with a strong religious affiliation. So there's definitely a broad spectrum, from atheists to non-religious to religious students of various backgrounds, but more students are holding a religious affiliation as quite central to who they are relative to my early time here. And so that is both fantastic for teaching religion, because there are more students who come in with an investment. They think it does matter. But it also is complicated pedagogically. How do you get students who actually have different kinds of perspectives and investments, from nothing or antithetical to religion to deeply committed to a particular form of a religious tradition, to actually be generous-spirited to one another and talk with each other about listening to the perspectives they bring, as well as to entertain maybe very different perspectives on thinking about how to study religion than they might have had coming in. So that's a challenge, but a really exciting one, including of course, there's many other ways in which the student bodies change, but I thought I'd mention that one.
Well, I could just comment that especially in my world in the sciences, the broadening of the student body has had a number of great effects on, especially given how collaborative the kind of learning that goes on at Williams is. In my department, students routinely work together on problem sets, on labs. There's a lot of working together, and I think that with a broadening of student body, international students, just lots of different perspectives, it's so valuable to have students who've had different kinds of training, different kinds of knowledge base, different kinds of ways of thinking and going at problem solving. And I think that collaborative nature of learning really benefits from having a diverse population. I would also say that in the fact that in the sciences we have more students that may have come from under-resourced high school backgrounds, but have tremendous talent and passion to do science. Williams is really ideally positioned to kind of nurture those students. And there are just many stories of students that I've taught in recent years who perhaps came from that under-resourced starting point, but as second, third, fourth year students have become leaders in their class. Remember a recent thesis student who was a first generation college student, Cuban-American family, and I taught him as a sophomore, and he was still in catch-up mode, working really hard, but catching up to where maybe some of his classmates had been. He became another of my thesis students. By the time he was a senior, he was confident, he was a leader in the class. He did a great senior thesis with me, and is now finishing up his PhD at University of Arizona doing solar energy research. And so, again, I think that at Williams, it's wonderful to be able to take a student that talented and make sure that they get where they need to go in the right way.
I'll pick up on things you both said. My first thought when you asked your question, Adam, was that the biggest change I've seen is the shortening of the attention span of our students. And I mean that both jokingly but also seriously. Yeah. And it's not our students, it's the world, right? It's that everyone's attention span is shortened. And really, I don't mean shortened, it's just that we have many more ways of distracting ourselves wherever we are, and our phones and our laptops and our computers and our multi-application screens and so forth. But that poses a particular challenge for those of us who are trying to get our students to engage deeply and closely with any kind of material, whether it's a 3-hour science lab or an hour-and-a-half-long seminar discussion or a problem set or a painting or whatever it is that they're trying to do. And so I find more and more that I have to be much more mindful in planning exercises and talking to students about the importance of slowing down and focusing in on particular tasks and particular concepts. And in a way, that means that I'm making different choices about what I teach. I might say, instead of reading 300 pages this week that in all likelihood is not going to get read by enough people, what if we only read 10 pages, but we read those 10 pages to death? We read them all the way through 10 times, and we get everything we can out of that material. And I'm finding myself doing that more and more with every passing year as a way of offering them some alternative to this digitized, scattered experience that they have of so much cultural consumption that they encounter. And it's not just students. I think that goes to your other question about faculty as well. Faculty are also much more distracted, to use the word in a neutral sense, in that we're able to be connected collaboratively with colleagues all over the place. The Williams faculty of 50, 60 years ago, they're in Williamstown, and maybe you'd make a trip once a year to a conference or to give a talk somewhere regionally. But now you're in constant contact with collaborators, you're working with people all the time, you're doing research in multiple continents simultaneously, and that means that we also as faculty sometimes have to remind ourselves to be attentive, and when we're teaching a class, to come back to our students and focus. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity because it allows us to reevaluate what's at the core of our teaching values, and it forces us to be much more mindful about our teaching practice than we otherwise would be.
Just to pick up, I mean, I've been here 6 years now, and one of the things that's really impressed me in my time here is that there are these narratives out in the larger conversation about higher education. The students are changing, they have short attention spans, and somehow we need to make education, bring our education entirely to them, and we should teach them in tiny little snippets and 3-minute segments. And we have not embraced that view here at Williams. I think Edan put it really well. We need to get them to slow down. And I think we've embraced the notion that one of the things that they need to learn when they're here, that they have the opportunity to learn when they're here, is to how to think in a different way. And that's doing them a service. It's not necessarily doing students a service to cater to the way they may be used to interacting with information. I think we see that throughout our faculty. So speaking of the faculty, the faculty has been changing as a whole as well over this decade. And maybe, Denise, I'll turn to you, particularly in your role as Dean of the Faculty, to share some thoughts on that evolution and where that's come and where you see that going.
Sure. Well, I'm sure my colleagues have something to say to that too, but we do have a faculty that's faculty is always in transition, but we have more faculty who will be retiring in the next dozen years or so, which means the faculty is changing in part by getting younger, because we're bringing in lots of great newer faculty. And I see the ways in which each department and program is really thinking about what can the curriculum look like, and paying attention to not only looking for ways to diversify our faculty so that it looks more like our student body, which has become much more demographically and socioeconomically diverse in all measures, but also to think about the ways that graduate education, although still happening within disciplinary fields and some interdisciplinary fields, even within those fields is increasingly interdisciplinary in its methodology. And so that's very exciting for me as somebody who's been here longer to learn from my newer colleagues and to be able to see the ways in which they're bringing perspectives to the college and the classroom that are fully in keeping with the mission we've always had to kind of be in conversation with each other across and outside of our units, as well as do the work inside our departments and programs as well as we can for our students. But to be able to learn both new pedagogical techniques as well as new perspectives on our field is really exciting. And I just want to give one example of that. We have these opportunities for faculty to gather together in reading groups or research groups over the course of the semester. And one venue for that is our great Oakley Center for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And a couple of years ago, I was part of a science and technology studies reading group with colleagues who were almost all in their first 3 years here. And I learned so much from them, just in terms of what to be reading, how to think about the material. And I think the more we make the effort to think about what these newer faculty are bringing, the better we'll be. So.
I kind of piggyback on that. In fact, exactly what you just said. A few years ago, I ran an Oakley seminar with a colleague of mine where we took fairly new faculty to the college, and everyone under 10 years essentially, from as many disciplines as we could, and precisely about the question of what will the liberal arts look like 30 years from now, and try to get faculty who are at the beginning of their career thinking precisely about these questions. And the answers that came out are precisely the things we've been talking about today, that Adam talked about yesterday at dinner, the importance of interdisciplinarity, of course, and collaboration. But one of the things that emerged, and ever since then I've been thinking about it quite a bit, is a challenge that we face when it comes to this great shift in terms of the faculty. And that is the way in which current generation of graduate students in their home institutions, when they're being trained, are not being told about the kind of holistic approach that we entertain at the liberal arts institution, at Williams in particular. And what I'm especially thinking about is the way in which so much of a premium now among graduate students is put on making sure that you do what's best for you, for yourself, for your individual career, for your research. and teaching is important but not as important, and service is almost never considered important. And these are becoming institutional messages in a lot of graduate institutions. And that means that it becomes harder for us to find that magical candidate that we have. Adam, you talked about those 100 conversations. We need to find those people that not only have the skills as researchers and teachers, but also are interested, at least willing to explore the different kind of mindset that's required to be at a place like this, to make a commitment that goes beyond just being an excellent researcher, an excellent teacher, but being collaborative and interdisciplinary and global and all those things, even in your off hours, even when you're not in the classroom or in your lab, and being part of a community in a way that is largely foreign to the modern graduate study experience. And I think that's going to be one of the great challenges. And we have to make the place as attractive as possible to those few candidates that do get that and do have that kind of adventurous spirit.
I think I've been thinking about recruitment a lot, about thinking about, both in my role as Science Center Director, thinking about what it takes to build the infrastructure to do science at a place like this. And in particular, our department is also hiring this year, so I'm thinking a little bit about the next physicist. And in that process, I found myself thinking a lot about building for flexibility, thinking about you can't predict what the next interdisciplinary cool thing is, and you want to be able to be there for the person who's just the perfect candidate that you would like to provide with that opportunity. Also been doing some recruiting on campuses and talking to graduate students and postdocs lately, and finding that it's surprising. We here at the liberal arts, we're so imbued with this, like, what makes Williams such a special place. There are a lot of people who are at big universities. Maybe they were international students who just are really fundamentally unfamiliar with what the opportunities at a place like this are, and especially a scientist who might be advised by their perfectly well-meaning advisor that there's just not an opportunity to continue a career at an institution like this. And I really feel like it's our job, especially as we try very hard to diversify and reach out to broader populations of potential faculty, to get the word out there about what liberal arts colleges are about. And how and what opportunities we just and let them have, like, all the information they need to make the right decision.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on that, and we actually are doing that. We're spending college resources to send, whether it's Tiku individually when he goes to give a talk at a research university, to spend another day to meet with graduate students to talk about what's a career at a liberal arts college like. We send other faculty regularly to places like Berkeley and Columbia as part of a kind of interinstitutional project that we have with those institutions, as well as to other major universities, to have sessions for graduate students, especially looking to invite graduate students and postdocs who may be from groups that are still underrepresented in higher ed, but also just generally, because the message that doctoral students receive still is often that a liberal arts college should be your backup plan, and your goal should be to teach at a R1 university. So we are doing more outreach to try to explain what it is we're doing here at a liberal arts college, so that we will have the best chance of recruiting a fantastic range of new generation of scholars and teachers here.
And I think it's important to point out that we're not, I mean, this is a one conversation at a time. Yeah. We're not looking to hire 600 people. We're looking to hire one at a time. And so every conversation can be valuable if that's the person that all of a sudden turns out to be this, like, perfect candidate that she or he didn't know they were.
Right.
All of a sudden it's, I was just out at Berkeley, had a conversation with an Iranian woman who's doing biophysics, and she had no idea when the conversation started about what a liberal arts college was, and 45 minutes later, she was really nodding her head saying, that sounds really interesting, I want to learn more about it. So, I mean, I think we are doing more, and we need to do more. Yeah.
I mean, the haystack is big, and we're really looking for those needles in that haystack. Right. I mean, we are entering a period where we're going to be doing a disproportionate amount of filling the positions left by retirement of wonderful, long-standing faculty, and it's an extraordinary opportunity to do all the things that we've been talking about here. broaden curricula, think about how we teach. But in particular, I think every faculty member has their own way of teaching. And there's no single cookie cutter way to do that. And one of the things I thought would be interesting to hear about is the different kinds of teaching that each of you do. What are the settings and how do those connect differently to different kinds of students? Someone want to jump?
I can start. I sometimes joke with my students. I teach mostly very, very old literature, and so I joke with my students when they come into a classroom and it's all rigged out with projector and all these things that we don't use any of that. That my classroom technology is a piece of chalk and the truth, or not. And it's the or not part that's actually important. Right? But I mean, what I have found, and I've experimented with a lot of different modes of teaching, from lecturing to seminars to tutorials to team teaching to hands-on teaching with materials in the Chapin Library and the Williams College Museum of Art. So I've even taught lab sessions in the humanities, courses that had required lab. But what I find, no matter what kind of course it is, no matter what technique I use, it always comes back to the same core thing, and that is that encounter, that authentic encounter between the student, the instructor, and the subject, the material, whether that material is a physical thing or a text or an equation or whatever it might be. To have as intimate and authentic a meeting between those three things is the core of every kind of successful teaching experience I've ever had. And whatever format I'm in, I try to put all the attention on that interaction, to get people to come as close to the thing as possible, to question it, to examine a concept, a text, from as many perspectives as possible. And that goes back to what we were talking about earlier with slowing down and being able to take advantage of our capacity to think in lots of different directions at once. But instead of thinking about 10 different objects, use all those different modes of thinking with one object in mind. And so that you can use technology and you can use incredible databases and library resources, and you can use a 500-year-old book, and you can use the textbook in front of you, but to learn to bring all of those things together. So in a sense, to be collaborative even as an individual student, to collaborate with yourself, if you will, with your scattered self, your self that has Facebook open and this open and that open, to learn to harness those things together. I think more and more that's what I'm coming to realize about the future of every mode of teaching at a place that puts such a premium on that intimacy.
On the one hand, I love the fact that at Williams, I get to teach in all these different kinds of venues, that I get to teach non-major students about, for example, the science of music and sound, which is a course I teach in because I'm an amateur musician, something I've always loved. I get to do that. Then I get to have the juniors and seniors who have had this 4 years of preparation and kind of like, talk to them, teach them in a small setting, get all these wonderful questions where I often have to answer, that's a really good question. And then to pause a little bit and see if I actually have an answer or whether I have to go away and think about it some more. And then to be able to see, to be able to also work with students in the lab one-on-one, which I consider to be a very important part of the teaching, the educational mission of my job at Williams. But then at the same time, I love the fact that the very same student, that we're not outsourcing any piece of this teaching, that the very same student I see in the classroom, I see in the teaching laboratory, and then in my office for office hours. So for so many students, it's different venues, they shine, they respond in different ways, and maybe this is the best way for them to actually make the connection that they really need to make to solve a problem or to understand something. And the fact that I get to, maybe see them in a tutorial or maybe see them in the classroom, maybe see in whatever it is, and that I get to be face-to-face with them is what makes my job special. Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah, I think the theme of close encounter with a student is a motif I would share, and I also teach mostly very old things, so I think that echoing a lot of what Tiku and Edan just said, I teach many different formats of classes, although almost all the courses I teach are writing intensive. So they're not usually very large, and whether they're a tutorial format or a lecture discussion or seminar format, there's a lot of writing involved. And my goal with the students is to get them thinking and talking with each other and not just with me. The tutorial format, of course, is brilliant for that. They must talk with each other and engage each other. But even in writing intensive classes where I'm seeing quite a lot of the writing, I try to create context in which they're sharing some of their writing with one another and not just having my role as the instructor to be the lightning pole or the lightning rod, but actually to be the person who helps to create the conditions for unknown weather so that the students are actually ideally engaged, as I said earlier, in a kind of generous spirit, but capacious way, curious manner, but also forced to confront complexity. So that those are some of the goals that I have in how I'm teaching. So the way that I teach may vary from format to format, but trying to get them to think about how they can articulate both orally and in writing, both capaciousness yet never settle for, being on the surface. Try to also be complex in their way of thinking so that they're forced to not only bring those pieces of themselves together, but to recognize that the lens that I'm never just giving them one lens in class. And that's partly because their fellow classmates bring multiple lenses, and it's partly because I'm not letting them get away with just one reading lens, for example, on biblical materials or early Christian history.
I would add to the complexity also rigor. That it's not enough for it just to be complex. We also have to provide them with a rigorous approach to the material. And one of the other things, when I'm not teaching the literature and the culture and the religion, I'm also often teaching language. I teach ancient Greek and Latin. And I use a line that one of my own Greek teachers gave me when I was an undergraduate, first week of class in my ancient Greek. I tell them, if you can master the Greek verbal system, you can master anything in the world. And I really believe that the rigor required to understand a complex linguistic system is a skill that is applicable to almost anything you're going to do. But it also has value in and of itself, that in engaging in something rigorously, you feel better about yourself and about the thing. It actually empowers you to have high-level skills. Think about how an athlete feels when they're performing at peak efficiency, or a musician is really nailing the piece on stage and knows that they're doing it. When I get a student and it's really clicked and now they're able to translate some passage from Homer and they're really understanding what it says, you can see the endorphins. They're running through them, they're flowing through them. And that then carries over into everything else that they do. And so that rigor is so important in addition to the complexity and the flexibility to explore in so many different directions and with so many different lenses.
One of the things I really love is to watch the trajectory. I'm teaching a lot of first semester students in this fall, and the trajectory of starting from the high school kind of beginning point, yes, it's introductory physics, and yes, there's a lot of things you have to learn, and you got to learn the language, and you've got to learn the basics, but trying to sneak in there rather than this sense of like, okay, here's yet another formula you need to master. This notion of like a little bit of how physicists begin to think about problems, problem-solving skills, which eventually the whole idea is that you get them to take more responsibility for their own education. I mean, that's the goal, so that they're working together, they're working on their own, and really appreciating that even though it might be a hard transition from the kind of learning and teaching that perhaps they had in high school, that they must learn and maybe unlearn a few things, and then begin to learn that it's not so much about, did I see this problem before? Wait a minute, it's got to be somewhere. Maybe it's on my iPhone or whatever. No, I've actually never seen this problem before, but let's figure out what step one might be to solving this problem. I mean, that's really, ultimately, as a scientist, where you want to get to. So it seems to me that the earlier we can begin them on there, even though it might be difficult at first, the better for their education. And it's great to watch that happen. As you say, when it clicks and when you see it happening, it's just really exciting.
I like what you just said about getting them to take responsibility for their own education. I mean, in a sense, that's really what we're trying to do. We're giving them tools, we're giving them ways to approach things, we're offering them objects of study from which they can choose the ones that they're most interested in. I often think of the classroom as just the starting point of this process, to get them to develop their own taste, their own understanding of their own capacities, their own interests, and then to take responsibility in an individual paper that they're writing, in a problem set, ultimately in a project they're working in a lab, or in a thesis they're writing, or in whatever else it is that they're doing. And so I think that's so important in the way you just described it.
That's been my own experience here. Teaching has been in the context of an independent study that I did with a very advanced physics student, a senior. And this was the thing that impressed me so much, was that the 3.5 years that he had had at Williams before I had the opportunity to spend time with him, he had developed such a sense of responsibility for his own learning, a sense of what it was to learn something rigorously. He was performing in that way with that sense of ownership like any second or third year graduate student that I would have seen at another institution. And that was clearly came from not just what he had been taught, but the way he had been taught it, and the kind of the culture of responsibility that had been inculcated simply by the interactions that he'd had in the classes and in our tutorials and with other students. It was extraordinarily impressive. I mean, one thing I'd like to touch on just a little more, we talked a little bit about it, is the different ways that students learn. And I'm interested if there are kind of ways that you adapt your own teaching or think about getting students into situations which are going to be particularly effective for them, since we have this opportunity at Williams really to know each of our students and kind of think about what it is that they need.
I can start. I think about this all the time. This is sort of a topic of obsession for me. It's how to create scenarios and to set up opportunities to meet the radical shifts that are happening in terms of the ways students come to us, and the commonalities that they might not have in terms of not just their educational background, but even the kind of cultural touchstones. You know, for 30, 40 years ago, everybody had the same 3 TV channels. So if you made a joke about something in popular culture, everyone knew it. And now it's 1,000 channels and 1,000 internet channels, and even what we think of as popular culture is so disparate. But it's also different learning approaches and styles, and we have so many international students and very different things. And so one of the things that I've been experimenting with quite a bit that I'd like to do more of is really trying to turn the teaching process inside out a little bit. And so I was teaching last year a course with a colleague of mine, Christopher Nugent, in the Chinese department on the history of the book, where we're trying to give them a kind of global history of books from ancient Mesopotamia through China into Europe and right up through the iPad. But instead of presenting lectures and readings and having them then come and discuss them, we decided to make the entire course activity-based. So we would come to class and we would say, your assignment due in 3 weeks is 1 sentence long. Make paper. And then they would have to go out and figure out, with no guidance, what that meant and what to do. And then when they came back, then we would have the readings and the historical context and so forth, to get them to try to do it experientially. And we did the same with printing and the same with copying out manuscripts and so forth. And it terrified the students. And it was extremely hard, actually, to get some of them to buy into the idea that they were generating the content for the discussion. But by the end, I think most of them had found something valuable in that encounter, not just with the activity, but force themselves to almost inductively produce the material that we could then have high-level discussions about. And so it's inspired me to try more of that and to pad sources and text less with apparatus and get students to try to encounter it primarily and authentically, and then generate their own apparatus and then compare that with the results of centuries of scholarship and of more advanced learning.
I don't have anything quite that exciting to share, but I think that's awesome. But one of the things that I do regularly, which helps me to figure out what kind of learner I have in the class and what kind of experience they're bringing or perspectives they're bringing, is I always, on the first day of class, give them a little sheet of paper that asks them to tell me a little bit about why they've signed up for the class. Maybe many of you did this even when you were students. Well, why are they in the class? How does it relate to other things that they're taking? I might ask them some kind of provocative content question that has to do with the course material, just to see how they react. And then I read those after the first day of class, and very, very shortly thereafter, I'll have an exercise in class that then allows me to tap into, articulate some of the things that I learned from those background information sheets. I also assign a paper very early on, a short one, within the first 2 weeks of class, so I can see some of their writing, and I require them all to come and meet with me or have lunch with me so that I get to know them. And then I will adjust activities in class or assignments depending on patterns that I notice for the students. So it's not all adapting it one-on-one for the students, but also taking advantage of what I learned to either decide I'm going to hold a debate in class in a certain way, or ask students to share information that I know they have that can contribute to the class material. So.
Over my career at Williams, I feel like I've had to learn a lot about how to step back a little bit in my teaching, because when you're super excited about what you do and you love physics and you want to share this, I mean, there's a tendency, and I certainly fell into this as a first-year faculty member, of just like I was going full speed ahead, and this is exciting, and then now stick with me because this is even more exciting, and now I think I've had to learn myself how to step back and let things sink in. Be a little more deliberate, and if less is more, the old kind of adage, if stuff can sink in and they can, as I was saying before, get through a class with maybe one less chapter of content, but with more of a sense of confidence that I can solve problems. This is interesting. I want to know more. I want to know the next thing. That's a much more valuable thing. In the context of my research, I've always also had to learn that giving students their first taste of research is a very, very tricky kind of a balance thing that you're doing. They're used to, here's the problem set, here's the material, here's the textbook. Even in a teaching laboratory, it's going to end at 4 o'clock because we've constructed the experiment to work. Eventually, it may not be trivial to put together, but it's going to end and it's going to work out. The idea of putting students into the context of a research lab where actually you don't know the answer and you have to admit to them that what you're suggesting that they try might not work. That's kind of unsettling for students, and I find that I've had to think more about that as a teacher, especially for the younger students, and keep it smaller, make the unsettling pieces, smaller projects, and then let them grow in their own way until they're comfortable with the idea that this is a 2-month project, and we don't actually know where it's going to end, but we have a good idea, and then at what point do we decide it's working, that's good, or no, we want to take a slight left turn, and let them become partners in that process. So this kind of slowly letting them be uncomfortable a little bit at a time with that sense of uncertainty has been an interesting learning experience for me.
I just want to echo, I think Edan said this earlier about assigning fewer pages, and you just said that about, sort of one fewer chapter. I think that is something that I've also learned over my time. I don't know whether that's about the student body changing or just becoming, growing into myself as a teacher, realizing that less is more, and that I used to hyper prepare hours and hours and hours and hours for every single class and have so much content that I could fill 3 classes worth, and realizing that I should actually be well prepared, but speak less and make it possible for the students to slow down. That's been something I've really noticed is necessary over time, and finding ways even in class to actually create uncertainties as opposed to producing certainties.
Yeah, and I think that if we can get our students, particularly in this day and age, to be comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty and conflicting ideas that they can hold in their heads at one time, to work their way through that, it's almost, to me, the most important thing, again, in this day and age that we can give them, because they don't come here with them models for that kind of nuanced and sophisticated thinking. As we're getting to the end of this, I'm going to pose one more question to each of our faculty. I think almost true of every single faculty member here at Williams. They could be working somewhere else, and thank God that they aren't. But why Williams? That is, what is it about being here that's particularly special? What are you hoping to accomplish in your decades here? It's a little reflection on this place and what it means to be here. I'll start, Tiku.
Sure. This might be a little science-centric, but I'll just tell just from my own perspective, the longer I was at research universities, first as an undergraduate, then as a graduate student, and then as a postdoc, the more I realized I didn't think that would be the right environment for what I wanted to do, which is the fact that I love to teach. But the longer I was involved in doing research in atomic physics and laser physics, the more I realized I would not be happy if that wasn't an important part of what I did as well. So it turns out that narrows down the pool to a very small group of kinds of institutions that could both really, really focus and celebrate teaching of undergraduates in every way that we teach them, but also functionally support the kind of ambitious research program I wanted to have as a career. And Williams has been the perfect landing place for me because it's one of the very, very few institutions that does both, that leaves us the space and the time to engage in research, and in my case, to include undergraduates in that work, but also the flexibility and the freedom to do all different kinds of teaching. I love the fact that in my department, we rotate around 80% of the curriculum. We don't teach the same class for 20 years. We teach the same class for a few years, get to know the whole curriculum, and by this point in my career, I've taught most of the classes in the curriculum, and I love that aspect as well. So being able to teach non-majors courses and majors courses. So for me, I just feel very, very lucky to have found a place that values the very things that I most value and can support them both in that way.
We're going down the line?
Yeah, we'll go down the line. We'll work our way back to me.
Great. For me, it's the conversations. I think if I had to boil it down, it's the fact that this is a place where we're engaged in a million conversations and one grand conversation all at once. In the classroom, in office hours, in the halls, conversations with my students, conversations with my colleagues, conversations with myself, all of it. It's seamless. It's an integrated life in the sense that there is no, these are my work hours and these are my home hours. The place for me is one grand life, and it's one conversation. And it's a conversation that goes on forever. And so I'm having it with a student today or with a colleague in the morning. I might have that same conversation 5 years from now when that student is now an alum working as a doctor or a lawyer or teaching somewhere or as a painter. And then I might come back to another conversation with a colleague. It's the openness of the place, the premium placed on the intimacy, the open doors of the offices that students can walk through, that colleagues can walk through, that they know that if my office door is open, that I'm inviting them to come in and talk about anything, and that it's not an interruption, it's the thing that I most welcome as part of my life here. I was about to say the word job, but job is not really the way I think about it. It's that notion that we're all here to talk to each other and to talk to each other about a million different things that we're passionate about, and passionate conversation. I'll leave it at that.
Right. For me, being here is being able to be a whole person. There's sort of a version of what both Edan and Tiku had said. I wanted to be at a place where I could get to know my students, learn from them, share my passion for all the things I'm interested in. And only a liberal arts college was going to enable me to teach courses, Introduction to Women's Gender Sexuality Studies, a tutorial on haunting, early Christian history, contemporary approaches to the study of agency and kind of feminist activism now, a course on theory and methods in the study of religion. I can teach all over the place, outside of my discipline, inside my discipline, my area of my subfield. That would not be possible at a research university. And so the ability to do that in a way where I'm benefiting from the interaction with my students and my colleagues. I can talk with colleagues in many different departments. I have fantastic colleagues within my department. And where my scholarship is equally supported, where I've been able to not only pursue my scholarship thanks to the resources of the college, and that it matters, that people care about it, but I've actually been able to do more creative scholarship that's had an impact broadly in my subfield than I ever would have if I'd been at an R1, not because I wouldn't have been doing my scholarship, but I'm asking questions because students are prompting them. They don't know where the disciplinary boundaries of early Christian studies are. You know, my KB D'Angelo, she didn't know that a biology, major couldn't be asking about, early Christian notions of health and illness. That I think being able to be in a context where I can, paint outside the lines in terms of my scholarship and in terms of my teaching and my training, and be able to contribute to the community, be able to be part of the workings of this college, not just in the role that I'm in now administratively, but as a faculty member all the way along, to be able to think with my colleagues and with students about how do we want this college to be? How do we want to interact with each other? And that's something that I couldn't have gotten at another place. And I just think we do it so well here. So,
I think if there's the single deepest continuity in what makes Williams, it is this. We talked about Mark Hopkins on a log 200 years ago, but the continuity is that it's the magic thing that happens between faculty and students. And it's a deeply personal thing, and I hope you've seen that today. I mean, it can only happen if you know your students one-on-one. There is no single one right way to do that. You don't, frankly, learn it out of a book. You don't learn it out of a course in education in the end. You learn it by coming into a community like this, as every single one of our faculty have, and finding your own way to dive deeply in with our students. And that commitment to being with our students is a perpetual thread of continuity in the college. The future of the college, I think, always has depended and always will depend, the strength of the college, on renewing, finding the new faculty as people retire, renewing that faculty, bringing faculty into this extraordinary culture of teaching and scholarship. And we are at a moment, again, where we're going to be doing that at an intensified rate over the next 8 years or so. And the Teach It Forward campaign really is about making that possible. It really is fundamentally about recreating the conditions where these extraordinary interactions between faculty and students take place. And that's financial aid to bring these extraordinary students to Williams, who we couldn't bring without a financial aid program that's really strong. It's about faculty support and professorships and research. And facilities, the critical facilities that the log is a lot more complicated place. It didn't have lasers on it 200 years ago, but it sure does now. You can't rock it back and forth. These facilities are equally essential to the work that we do. But all of this really is about supporting this kind of fundamental interaction between human beings that is the secret sauce, if you will, of Williams. And that, of course, happens in the classroom. We talked a lot about that this morning and right now. There are really important things that happen outside the classroom as well, in the community as a whole. So this afternoon, you'll have the opportunity to experience that. But first, we're going to have the opportunity to have some lunch. So thank you all for coming.